This is Steve Zeltzer with Workweek, and Workweek has covered many of the struggles of the ILWU Local 10 International, their whole struggle for internationalism, and including the fight in 1984 against the Apartheid regime in South Africa, where they refused to load and unload cargo, and their struggle particularly in support of Palestinian workers in 2010 and 2014, and now most recently there was an action against the ZIM ship line, which is owned by Israel. And joining us is Jack Heyman, who has been a leading activist, internationalist in the ILWU Local 10, former business agent, former international transport workers agent, and an activist in Local 10. So welcome to Workweek, Jack.
Thank you, Steve. It's good to be here.
So, Jack, why don't you talk about recent developments in the history of the ILWU and why this recent struggle against ZIM is so important? It's been pretty much blacked out in the news, censored in the news, that there's been a West Coast action to really go after ZIM because of its control by Israel, the apartheid regime in Israel. And the ILWU has played a leading role in taking solidarity action, including the most recently Prince Rupert in Canada, where longshoremen refused to cross the picket line and actually were penalized as a result of that.
Well, this is the third time in recurring instances when the Longshore Union has honored picket lines by protesters against the Zionist regime in Israel for its brutality and massacres of Palestinians. There was one just in 2010 where we stopped. There was a massive protest, maybe a couple thousand people in the port of Oakland. The longshoremen honored that picket line. That was in protest of the Freedom Flotilla that was going to Gaza, that the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, attacked, and people were actually killed and injured. And then 2014, again, the Gaza war, there were a massive protest there, initially called by Block the Boat, which is supported by the Arab Resource and Organizing Center, and the Stop ZIM Action Committee. And that stopped the operation of a ZIM ship for several days, actually, and got tremendous support from the Longshore Union. And then ZIM ships stopped coming into the port because of the unreliability of their cargo being able to get discharged and loaded. And by the way, ZIM is actually, it was privatized about 15 years ago, so it's no longer the government-owned shipping line that it initially was. Nevertheless, the point of the protesters is to put pressure on the Israeli government to stop these atrocities, to let them know there's a cost that they will have to pay if they continue to oppress the Palestinian people.
And we're talking with Jack Heyman, who's a retired member of ILWU Local 10. Now, Jack, the ILWU is one of the few, and I think only union in the United States to actually take direct action. Why is it so unique, the action of the ILWU, and why aren't other unions around the United States who have passed resolutions, for example, opposing the Israeli attacks on Palestinians and also supporting the shutdown of U.S. military and economic aid to Israel?
Well, that's an interesting question. A lot of unions members have become upset with the U.S. government's policy of supporting Israel war after war after war against the Palestinian people. And a number of resolutions have been passed, and that's fine. The problem is paper resolutions really don't do anything to discourage the Israeli repression of Palestinians. There have to be actions behind these resolutions. And the ILWU is unique in that situation because in terms of this global economy, dockworkers have tremendous power if they exert it. Power at the point of production in the ports. And so the ILWU on the West Coast has been supporting these sort of actions. Actually, we initiated an action in 1984 against the apartheid regime in South Africa. Members voted to just refuse to work the ship, and that is actually in violation of Taft-Hartley. Nevertheless, the members took that action, and for 11 days, we stopped the Ned Lloyd Kimberley from being unloaded. And it really was a watershed moment for the ILWU, because Nelson Mandela, who was in Robben Island in prison there at the time in 1984, was freed 6 years later and did a world tour in which he stopped at Oakland Coliseum. And he acknowledged the key role that the Longshore Union played in building the anti-apartheid movement here in the Bay Area. And I think that resonated deeply with our membership. So since then, particularly since 1984, we've been actively doing actions using our power in the port to support workers, for instance, in Charleston, South Carolina, when they were under attack by the state government there. We also did an action in support of workers in other countries. Probably the Israeli anti-Israeli actions are directly related to the anti-apartheid action. But I think in this particular situation, what happened this last month in June, when the Volans came into port, that's the ship that was chartered by ZIM lines, it was more like the action that we took in support of the Liverpool dockworkers. So we had a ship in port that we refused to unload that sought another port on the West Coast, and they couldn't find any because all of the West Coast ports are ILWU organized. And we put the word out that no other local should work this ship. And they couldn't find one. They went up to Canada because they thought if it's a different country, it might be a different union, I suppose. But the Vancouver longshoremen are in the same union. They're ILWU as well. They refused to work the cargo. They sent the ship to Yokohama. We sent word to Yokohama that this is hot cargo on this ship. It comes by the company that runs the port of Liverpool. And we asked them in solidarity to stand with us. They did. And that was 3 international ports. So here we are today, and the Volans could not get unloaded in Oakland. So the company, ZIM, was desperate to try to get it unloaded in some port on the West Coast. And they couldn't find anything in the continental U.S., so they went up to Vancouver again, but there were already protests happening in Vancouver. So they had to find a remote and isolated port that nobody heard of, and that was Prince Rupert Port, which is all the way north in British Columbia. Small port, 12,000 people, a relatively new union, and that's what they decided to target. Even though it was way out of the way for the destination for the containers, they realized that was the only port on the entire West Coast that they had a chance of unloading it.
So what happened at Prince Rupert, the port of Prince Rupert in British Columbia, Jack?
Yeah, so that was interesting because it was relatively new and remote. There were not a lot of people to come out and protest, but the Arab Resource and Organizing Center, through Block the Boat, was able to gather together some sympathetic people in Prince Rupert to come out and picket. And so they picketed for a couple days. But as their numbers were depleting, the union bureaucracy in the ILWU in Canada put tremendous pressure on the local members to go to work, to cross the picket line. However, there was a key person in that union leadership, Darcy Nelson, who is Aborigine First Nation, a woman who was the only woman business agent, as far as I know, on the entire West Coast, maybe in the U.S. It's a key position in the union. They enforce the contract. They're there for health and safety of their members. And so Darcy was on the picket line and realized that this was not only were workers sympathetic to the plight of Palestinians, but it was a health and safety issue. And so she did her job, and for 2 days, they didn't cross the picket line. But finally, the union bureaucracy, the president of the local and the president of the ILWU in Canada, exerted so much pressure that the members started to dwindle in and cross the picket line. So it was because of the union bureaucracy that they were able to get the ship loaded, offloaded, that is. But what they didn't realize when they pulled this gimmick of going up to Prince Rupert is that it's part of the ILWU. And at that particular time, the Longshore Caucus, which is a convention of delegates from every port on the West Coast, and we let the Canadian brothers and sisters know that one of the 10 guiding principles of the ILWU is we never cross picket line. We emphatically told the union officials and the members to honor the principle of the ILWU. And so what happened here was the company, DP World, which is owned by an Arab businessman from the United Arab Emirates, sought penalties against the workers that refused for 2 days to cross the picket line. And they were put on non-dispatch. In other words, they lost 4 days' pay. So this issue was taken to the caucus, and President Trent Willis of Local 10 made a really brilliant speech and intervention at the caucus and was able to win over the majority. Now, this wasn't just something that was a slam dunk. It was quite a fight, because what probably most listeners here don't understand is that the international president of the ILWU, the International Longshore Warehouse Union, Willie Adams, went to Israel in 2006 on a trip that was organized by the Zionist government. Came back and he wrote an article for the union newspaper, which was a simple propaganda piece for the Israeli government. There was no mention of the plight that Palestinians suffer under Israeli control in Gaza or the West Bank. And a number of ILWU members up and down the coast, I think about 40, wrote a letter to the editor that pointed out that this conflicts with ILWU's position on Israel and Palestine. And furthermore, it doesn't even mention the horrendous repression that's suffered by the Palestinian people on a daily basis. And so that caused a big uproar in the union. So when Darcy Nelson took this stand, she was not only taking the stand against her local bureaucracy, but against the international president of the ILWU, who's an open, unabashed supporter of the Zionist government of Israel.
And we're speaking to Jack Heyman. Well, Willie Adams, who is the president, is not the only big supporter of Israel. During this latest attack on the Palestinian people, the bombing, the killing of children, the AFL-CIO, the Teamsters, the SEIU have been completely quiet about this attack, financed by the United States, supported by U.S. planes, supplied planes and equipment. Why the silence by the AFL-CIO, the U.S. trade union bureaucracy? Are they supporters of Zionism, a Jewish state, an apartheid state?
Yes, they are. As a matter of fact, I think it's more clearly understood when one looks at the perspective of the AFL-CIO historically. It's pretty much in the pocket of the Democratic Party. What the positions of the Democratic Party are deeply reflected in the AFL-CIO bureaucracy and in many of the trade union bureaucracies in the U.S. And so when the Democratic Party, whether it's Biden or Obama, take a position on Israel, you can pretty much expect that's where the AFL-CIO stands. And that's why they've been silent. And this is nothing new just around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But look at the right-wing white supremacist attack on January 6th on the Capitol. The AFL-CIO did nothing. Here's a powerful labor movement that represents millions of workers in the U.S., and they did nothing because the Democratic Party didn't want any kind of confrontation in Washington, D.C. There's a role that the AFL-CIO could play, but because of their tight connection to the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, the leadership of the Democratic Party, they do nothing at critical moments. And we've experienced that in the ILWU directly when we had a big strike up in the Northwest in the port of Longview on the Columbia River when workers were sitting in, occupying a grain terminal. The husbands and wives were sitting on the railroad tracks, blocking the grain trains that were coming in with grain. They were giving it their all in a sustained militant action against these international grain conglomerates. And what did the Obama administration do? They sent in an armed escort, a Coast Guard escort, a Coast Guard cutter, actually, to escort the scab ship into port. And that was the signal that the government was coming into side with the employers. And it ended up breaking the strike action that the union had going, the picketing action. So it's time and again that we see the Democratic Party stepping in, siding with the employers, and in the case of Palestine, Israel, siding with the repressive Zionist government of Israel.
And we're speaking with Jack Heyman. This is Work Week. And one of the issues that has come up is a growing sense in the black working class that the attacks on Palestinians is connected to the attack on blacks here in the United States, the racist attacks that are escalating around the United States against Asians and others as well. And the fact that during the time of Trump, when he was launching these racist attacks on blacks and others, there was a complete silence by the AFL-CIO, the SEIU, the Teamsters, not a word challenging Trump. You think they were afraid of challenging Trump, or they really don't want to mobilize the working class against these racist attacks?
Well, I think it's clear that they don't want to mobilize against racist attacks. The ILWU, on the other hand, particularly Local 10, which I should point out is a majority black and brown local, probably 75% of the local is black and brown. So we're sensitive to these questions of racism, for instance, under apartheid in South Africa or here at home. And we've had a number of demonstrations recently on May Day to oppose police terror. But it can't just be one union. It has to be across the board with other unions joining in. And that's the difficulty that we've had because the AFL-CIO bureaucracy and other trade union bureaucracies are not going to challenge the Democratic Party and mobilize its membership to stop these racist attacks. And you have to remember also that many of the attacks on black people and then the response of Black Lives Matter protests, they've been repressed by Democratic administrations in the state government and in city governments across the country. This is not just a Republican Trump problem. It's something that existed in the United States since the very beginning. And racism is something that's not clearly challenged in this country. From time to time, there are demonstrations and protests, but they're not sustained protests because the organized labor movement is not part of that. And that's a critical point that people have to understand. We have the power. Trade unions is where workers are integrated. In general, they're not. The schools are not integrated. The neighborhoods are not integrated. The churches are not integrated. The one institution in capitalist America that is integrated are the trade unions. They have the power to stop these racist attacks.
And there are two strikes going on now in Alabama with United Mine Workers of America, a mine, and they've been on strike against concession bargaining and givebacks, as well as UAW Volvo workers in Virginia, where the UAW leadership forced concessions, a two-tier contract. These workers are trying to get support nationally and internationally. It seems like, the AFL-CIO, the trading bureaucracy, don't want to mobilize even for workers in this country, much less workers in other countries, such as Palestine and Chile and other countries.
Well, I would agree with that. Here's the weak point, is when unions were strong, the Democratic administration of Harry Truman passed an anti-labor law. We call it Slave Labor Act. It was Taft-Hartley. That meant that trade unions could not strike in sympathy with other unions. And it's been the guillotine that's been held over labor's head for all these years. We've challenged it by actions. For instance, the anti-apartheid action I mentioned earlier was a direct challenge to Taft-Hartley. We violated Taft-Hartley by having a sympathy strike, a solidarity strike, we would prefer to call it, with the anti-apartheid movement, the people of South Africa. We need to do more of that in the trade union movement. So you talk about the miners in Alabama, and let's not forget the Amazon workers in Bessemer, right nearby. The way that these struggles are going to be won is by other unions taking action in solidarity with them. That's going to mean breaking the law. And the longshore workers in Mobile, in Jacksonville, in New Orleans, all these southern ports should be refusing to handle, they should have refused to handle Amazon cargo in the midst of that organizing drive. That's the kind of leverage that's needed to win union organizing drives. And it's the kind of power that's needed to win the miners' strike. If these goods weren't shipped on the railroads or in trucks or on ships, we have the power to stop that. But it's not being utilized. And that's why the labor movement, in my opinion, in this country is atrophying.
And Amazon has just signed a 10-year contract with the ZIM line to ship their products from China all over the world. Amazon obviously wants to make money and wants to support this Israeli company. But China itself is investing in Israel, is for a two-state solution. In South Africa, the government of the ANC supports Israel, an Israeli state, a Jewish state. It seems like these both the governments that call themselves communist and regimes that call themselves democratic are actually helping an apartheid regime.
Well, I think companies that, or countries rather, that are part of this global capitalist economy that participate in it, of course, trade benefits Israel. So any country that participates in it, in the global trade, particularly with Israel, it's going to support them to some extent. But even more than China or any other country that you can name are the own Arab bourgeoisies that participate in the repression of Palestinian people directly. I'm talking about the Hashemites, the kingdom of Jordan, that massacred thousands of Palestinians in Black September in 1970. I'm talking about the massacres in Shatila and Sabra outside of Beirut by the Phalangist army in collaboration with the Zionist army. Thousands of people were killed in those camps. And today, the Egyptian military government, along with the Israeli government, keeps Gaza imprisoned. It's not just the Israelis that are pressing the Palestinian people. It's Arab capitalist governments directly repressing. That impacts Israel much more than China or any other country. They're the ones that sustain the oppression of the Zionist government of the Palestinian people. And until that political situation changes in the Middle East, and I believe it's only going to change when there's a social revolution in Israel-Palestine that overthrows their own bourgeoisies. And that's the Hebrew-speaking working class and also the Arabic-speaking working class. There are going to have to be changes in these monarchies, in these repressive Arab governments, before there's any change in Israel.
And we're speaking with Jack Heyman. Of course, the United States is big supporters of these regimes, United Arab Republic, United UAE, Saudi Arabia. The fight in the United States for a political alternative, a Labor Party, where do you see that going? Because, for example, the Vermont AFL-CIO opposed the Trump said that there should be a general strike. Now, Richard Trumka is trying to shut them down, doing an investigation of them. It seems like the fight in the United States for political independence of working people, you come straight up against this trade union bureaucracy, which is in bed with the Democratic Party and gives millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars to the Democratic Party.
Well, this has been a long-running issue within the labor movement. You know, there was the Labor Nonpartisan League back in the 30s that tried to build an independent movement within the working class that never really succeeded. The McCarthy period was tremendously repressive against any kind of left-leaning political movement in the U.S., and it continues today. More recently, in I think it was 94, the Labor Party advocates had a convention in Cleveland to try to form a Labor Party. But the problem that they face over and over again is that these union bureaucrats are tied hand and foot to the Democratic Party. Even some of those that were in the Labor Party advocates were not serious about breaking with the Democratic Party. I've said over and over again when I was in the Longshore Union, I'm retired now, but when I ran for office, I would always run on a program calling for building a workers' party in this country to break with the twin parties of capital. I think workers would understand it more clearly if there were independent action like I was talking about before, directly confronting the government over Taft-Hartley and having solidarity strikes. That shows the power of the labor movement. At the same time, it shows that it's both parties, Democrat and Republican, that support these kind of laws. Now, interesting point here, the Democratic Party is pushing this PRO Act, which they say will ban Taft-Hartley. But I'll tell you right here and now that I know, I'm firmly convinced that the Democratic Party will drop that key part of the PRO Act. They won't go for that. And that's what we have to do is have these kind of class struggles at the point of production to support each other that makes it clear that we need our own party because neither party represents the working class in this country. So Trent Willis, the president of Local 10, led a revolt, essentially, against the international leadership, the president of the ILWU, and the caucus the majority voted to support the Prince Rupert longshore workers by stating, by demanding that the penalties against them, which were 4 days of non-work, so 4 days pay, that they got the company to retract that. But so there were no disciplines, and there was a threat of a court suit by DP World against the workers. That was retracted as well. But what happened behind the back of the workers, the longshore workers, the rank and file of the ILWU and Prince Rupert, the local president negotiated a deal despite the intervention of the ILWU caucus. He negotiated a deal that gave 1 day off for the workers for honoring a picket line. That's scandalous. The workers didn't find out about that till afterwards. So essentially it was a paper punishment. But once that's on your record and there's another picket line that you respect, then the company can demand progressive discipline. In other words, instead of just 1 day off, maybe you'll get a week off next time. So this is the trade union bureaucracy, the one that's so linked to the bourgeois parties, whether it's in Canada or the U.S., is an obstacle to class struggle. And that's the clearest example that one can give.
Okay, well, I want to thank you for joining us on Work Week. We've been talking with Jack Heyman, retired member of ILWU Local 10, a longtime activist fighter for internationalism, against racism, and also for the Palestinians against the attacks by the Israeli government. So thanks for joining us on Work Week.
Thank you.